Okay, so we'll start as we are a couple of minutes already behind our schedule. I'd like to start this session by acknowledging that we're meeting on the land of the Ngunnawal people and the Ngambri people, and I pay my respect to elders past and present and acknowledge that this was and always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you for joining this session, everyone. We have three presentations that brings a feminist analysis to economic dimension of gender inequality. They consider three interrelated aspects of systems that underpin gender inequality and ways to enable change that shifts power. We will start with considering the enabling role of finance and effective approaches to building women's financial resilience. We will then look at different contribution ways of considering the philanthropic sector supporting gender equality. And then third, we will look at the role of care and interactions between the care economy and women's labor force participation. As you most likely all know, gender inequality is rooted deeply in social and economic systems and structures. So transforming these so that they work for women, support equity and inclusion requires shifting policies and practices, formal and informal institutions, norms, and standards. So it's a big agenda that requires significant investment of resources. And I do want to quote a couple of stats before I hand over to Sara. Just to ground us into the importance of resourcing women's rights organization and gender equality. So you may already know that 4% of the official development assistance goes to from ODA as going to gender equality as a principal focus. And that is specifically to women's rights organizations, $690 million a year as an average. So hold that number, $690 million a year as an average going to women's rights organization from ODA. To put this into perspective, US-based anti-gender and anti-gender equality groups and movement received an average of $620 million per year in the 10 years between 2008 and 2017. So that is a good grounding for us to talk about the need to sharpen our focus on gender equality and inclusive development and how vital that is. And we have wonderful speakers today to join us. And so let me introduce them very briefly. You can see their full bios into the app. So I'm only going to give you names and titles. We will start with Dr. Sara Niner, who is a senior lecturer in anthropology at Monash University. Then we've had to have a change of program. And so I want you to have a really warm welcome for Muadi Mukenge, who is the Director of External Affairs at MADRE, and so who is joining us at the last minute. So thank you so much. And then finally, we will hear from Dr. Elise Stephenson, who is the Deputy Director of the Global Institute of Women's Leadership at the ANU, and Dr. Betty Barkha, who is a Research Fellow with the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, also at ANU, a Technical Advisor to Save the Children Australia, Frida Young Feminist Fund, the Global Resilience Funds, and also co-chair of AWDA. So I'm going to now give the floor to Sara, who will speak to the demands and possibilities of financial access and resilience for shifting power, and ask you all to jot down your question, write down your questions as we go through presentation, as we have built time at the end of the three presentations to come to you and answer your questions. Thank you so much. Over to you, Sara.
Is actually a group effort. So it's based on three case studies, a case study of savings and loan groups in East Timor, a study with microfinance participants in Bangladesh undertaken by my PhD student, Kambia. He couldn't be here today because he's in Bangladesh, but we did make a similar presentation to this in August together at the Feminist Finance Forum put on by the UN Red Cross. And also there's a case study on Sri Lanka with microfinance participants there, undertaken by another of our PhD students at Monash University, Neda Da Silva, who's just had a baby and couldn't be here today either. So here's a picture of one of the women that I interviewed in East Timor on the here. But I'll just do a little brief sort of framing of microfinance programs globally, because it's a huge global industry, as I'm sure many of you here are aware. Microfinance loans for women to poor women around the world is a huge financial industry. So, but as an anthropologist, I like to put it into context that there were always forms, Indigenous forms, traditional forms, grassroots, community forms of economic exchange and activities that saw people through, difficult times, seasonally and through crisis, etc. And the earliest microfinance programs copied these traditional forms. And it's grown, and these earlier forms were quite grassroots, but it has now transformed into this huge finance industry that doesn't necessarily benefit all the women who receive these loans and other financial products. And also now there's much more transformative financial answers to the problem of poverty in the world that I won't go into here, but it's probably what I'm advocating for. So this it used to be called, micro loans, then microfinance. Now it's called, in the sort of jargon in the development world, financial resilience programs. And these are the four areas that it considers, fixing, strengthening economic resources, financial resources, financial behaviour and knowledge and social capital. And the rationale in a similar framework here is given by some academics from IDS in the UK, is that it will benefit people economically, socially, for gender equality and in behavioural ways. That's the aim of these financial resilience programs. So these are the three case studies I'm going to show you. Bangladesh, Sri Lanka and Timor-Leste, which is where I have done pretty much all my research into gender issues in that place. So I did this study back in 2018 for Oxfam, looking into their micro savings groups. So the groups got together, they saved their own money and lent. So the groups, we have this positive finding that the groups were meaningful for building economic and social resilience and protection. People love their groups. But a lot of them had taken out microfinance loans from microfinance institutions.
Here is some of the comments that we had about the microfinance institutions. Basically, people didn't like paying interest to people they didn't know. They quite liked it in their own groups where they benefited from the interest. But I just sort of highlighted a few comments here in green, one from one of the male participants saying, we love these groups because we don't have to depend on other people. We manage our own money and we can meet our household needs. And another one from a woman here, money from MFI, she named the organisations which we obviously took out, is from the government. But this group is our own. It's our own money. After forming this group, we feel free. So we had really positive comments about these sorts of groups, but lots of negative comments about the bigger MFIs that were lending them the money. So as far as Tanvir's research in Bangladesh, these were some of his main findings. And I can flick through the comments of some of his research participants that he drew these findings from. He found that the big microfinance programs in Bangladesh, which is kind of the home of the current iteration of microfinance programs, that they didn't address women's structural vulnerabilities within patriarchal social systems. And because most of these programs said one of the main aims was to empower women, he was assessing that as part of his research questions. He also found that the programs re-entrenched submissive gender power relations, particularly from the microfinance officers that would come out to collect the loans from the women. There was often a lot of bullying going on. And it reinforced the division of labour in the home and the restriction on women's mobility, leaving the home, and on their financial dealings, because basically the loans went to the men in the household. The women didn't actually have very much control of them at all, but they were the ones that got bullied to repay them by the officers. So he did a study on women that had been taking out micro loans for a while, and he found this. Sorry, this is such a busy chart, but this is what he found, that it hadn't really changed women's duties in the home or any of the other sort of division of labour, the traditional division of labour. And you can see here the pies that are very orange, they're mostly women doing the unpaid working hours, not allowed mobility when they're children, marrying earlier, etc. So he found that the microfinance programs didn't have any effect on these things. So as far as Sri Lanka goes, it's another big industry like Bangladesh, you know, huge millions of women taking these microfinance loans out. The picture's actually of a protest to stop women having to repay the loans. There was a big social movement against microfinance loans in Sri Lanka, and it's you know, it's become, with the economic crisis there, it's got worse, the impact of these loans on women. So it was a post-war initiative of the government to allow these microfinance institutions to lend to women living in poverty in Sri Lanka, and Netta found that a lot of the practices were quite predatory, and it's led to violence, harassment and abuse amongst the women that she interviewed. And many women borrowers requested alternative models than these high interest loans that they were taking out. So when we added up these three case studies together, these were some of the findings that we together sort of concluded. While it's believed that financial inclusion or microfinance programs are a worthwhile development intervention to raise the status of women, methods and outcomes are greatly contested. For women-only groups, potential negative impacts are increased work burdens because they're starting businesses on top of their own domestic duties, a backlash against challenging gender roles, and established power hierarchies leading to conflict in households. And I think one of the people that I quote from here is in the room with us now. Vulnerable populations suffering from poor health. So we're really thinking about those post-war, post-conflict societies like Sri Lanka and Timor-Leste particularly, and that and Bangladesh too, people living in extreme poverty, that people that vulnerable shouldn't really be expected to be made responsible for solving their own poverty in those situations, which is what these microfinance programs do, and that perhaps they should be, you know, given universal basic, you know, income and more transformative programs like that, because women become trapped in debt cycles, leading to taking more loans out to pay one loan, and also the stress, conflict, bullying, abuse. And there's been suicides in Sri Lanka from these things. So the alternative programs that we recommend are the ones like Timor-Leste, where they're more savings focused, people getting together and saving together and lending to each other, rather than the microfinance loans with actually incredibly high interest sometimes. Which I think one of the scholars working in this area, Phil Matters, called financialising poverty. So the Savings for Change program, which Oxfam had introduced since the ones that I studied in Timor-Leste, these worth programs also we thought were better than the big microfinance institutions and the way they were implementing their programs. And then some of these smaller programs in the Solomon Islands also. So the implementation was different in these programs. They were based on savings. They were spent on community activities, the excess money that was saved in the groups. There was the systems suited the women's lifestyles a lot more and the community, their community activities. So there's just some details there of why we thought those programs were better. So these, finally, this is my final slide. These are the recommendations, some of the recommendations that we arrived at based on the research of the 3 case studies and some other work we did with our students at Monash, that groups should really build up the skills of women, the confidence, the well-being of women, especially those living in extreme poverty, hardship or post-conflict. There should be a focus on savings rather than credit and debt. Financial groups and institutions should be based on a not-for-profit model and cap interest rates at low levels. I've said here 3%, because we all know how much people are suffering at the moment in Australia when they're up around 5%. Create enabling environments for women's empowerment, women's safe spaces, learning and capacity strengthening networks. Include gender experts and women's representative organisations in the participatory design of programs, financial regulations and consumer protection. This one really came out of Sri Lanka. This is what women asked for. Provide appropriate, effective financial and business training within the groups, and that there should be memorandums of understanding or contracts with husbands, communities and institutions. Some of this came out of Timor-Leste, especially the contracts with husbands, so that it was agreed within the family that the woman could attend the meetings, go to the group activities, and that he would do the housework. And that seemed to solve some of the problems, some of the conflict in the households that these groups created. Slow and non-confrontational change to gender norms rather than abrupt changes. And we also added our last one here, that we should be looking at the systems that create the poverty in the first place, the structural change to neoliberal frameworks or transformative development. And I think that's all. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sara, for those insights and consideration into microfinance institution and approaches in supporting gender equality or not. I would like to now invite Muadi to share MADRE's experience of operationalizing a decolonizing philanthropy that engages and enables women's rights organization and, importantly, lived experience. And just to note that MADRE partners with women's human rights activists from Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa to create program and engage in advocacy in their communities and globally to meet urgent needs and advance lasting peace and justice. So, Muadi, over to you.
Good morning, and we're really pleased to be with all of you. Can you hear me? I want to make sure I'm clear. And so MADRE was...
Yes, we can. Yes, thumbs up.
Wonderful. Okay. MADRE was founded in 1983, and we began with a group of women activists who traveled from the US and traveled to Nicaragua to witness the impact of the US-sponsored Contra war. And since that time, we've resolved to build alternatives to war and violence by supporting the priorities of grassroots partners. Our niche is to work with women's rights movements that are really at the forefront of movements to end war, to offer solutions to climate change, and to address violence against women. And so we work beyond the concept of gender to really address the root causes of injustice, to advance a feminist approach that offers an alternative set of values to guide funding and to guide policy, to guide movement building, and to guide partnerships as well. MADRE works across 3 program areas of ending gender-based violence, addressing climate justice, and building a just peace. And we support a range of organizations, which include established organizations, but also newly registered organizations. We also support individual activists and human rights defenders. Slide number 2, please. The next slide. What we offer is a holistic model of support to partners. The previous slide. We offer a holistic model of support, which includes grant making and what we call capacity bridging, and then legal advocacy. And these meet urgent needs in communities as well as support long-term transformation. By urgent needs, what I mean is that we do offer grants that support livelihoods, that support shelters, that also look at immediate needs during catastrophes. But at the same time, we provide flexible funding that enable organizations to implement long-term solutions and transformative initiatives at the community level. And so since we were created 40 years ago, we've made over 69 million in grants. And just this fiscal year, for example, we awarded 4.6 million in grants in the form of 254 grants. And so keep in mind, some of these grants are to individual activists and human rights defenders with an average grant size of about 18,000. And so what is the vision for this work? And I want you to also understand these 3 components. The grant making provides those flexible resources. The capacity bridging indicates the commitment that we have to strengthen the organizations that are at the forefront of these issues, and also to enable these groups to form networks among themselves, to really facilitate sharing of information and enabling Global South partners to operate as trainers and experts for each other. And then through our legal advocacy, we support partners to identify the key issues and human rights violations that they want to elevate. And we build up skills in order to enable them to more effectively pursue justice and pursue peace initiatives. And this happens from the village all the way up to the United Nations and transitional justice mechanisms. The next slide. This graphic illustrates our theory of change, that by resourcing women leaders and their movements, we enable and amplify effective localized strategies, thereby leading to systemic change. And so this tells you that MADRE has been practicing localization for 4 decades. This is our way of working. This is our commitment to make sure that marginalized populations on the ground have the resources to bring about the change that they experience. The next slide, please. And so who are these priority populations? We are committed to promoting equity and philanthropy by focusing on those populations that don't usually get a lot of attention. And so that commitment to equity and shifting power is at the core of what we do. We uplift the leadership of visionary women and young people, and I've been able to meet some of them, but some of our partners have been with us for 10 years, some for 20 years. And so these are long-term trust-based relationships whereby we prioritize people with disabilities, indigenous communities, Afro-descendant women, rural women, also refugees, and the internally displaced. And so the decision to work with marginalized communities is itself a matter of justice for us because they have been historically excluded. And we feel that it's a really key strategy to advance human rights. And so this presentation will aim to share our best practices to leverage funding to these communities and movements, and also the strategic advocacy that they undertake. And overall, making an argument that this strengthens the philanthropic sector. And we'll take examples from these movements here, indigenous movements, disability movements, and also look at some work that's happening in climate justice, peace and anti-militarism, and gender-based violence, with a few examples from the Asia Pacific region. And so the moderator gave some statistics with regards to some of the gaps in funding that currently exist. And for the populations that we work with, the reality also is that only 2% of international human rights funding and development aid goes to disability communities, and less than 1% of international giving is directed towards indigenous communities. And we make the argument also that funding with a gender lens is decreasing, unfortunately, across the globe when gender-based violence is increasing and there's an overall backlash on women's rights. And so this really makes it imperative for us to look at the gaps in funding. And that's one of the things that we discussed in our abstract, and to reflect the conversations that are happening in the aid sector around equity, around inclusion, and working at the grassroots. And so this is really at the core of what MADRE does. And what we want to do is to share how we implement this vision and how we move from grant making to the policy making and positioning partners to really bring their own voices to decision makers and change the context in which they live. The ripple effect of our work of making grants has enabled women's groups to actually now manage their own funds. And so from making grants to groups to implement interventions, some of those partners now do their own regranting. And so this shifts power, this shifts the decision-making to those local groups. And so we're devolving funds to these hyper-local groups as a feminist practice and really meeting women where they're organizing. We have specifically been able to implement this in Iraq and also most recently through a Haitian Women's Fund. And we offer the opportunity to look at the UN Loss and Damage Fund for climate change as an opportunity, again, to make sure that funds are directed towards grassroots communities that are most impacted by climate change. Another way that we have implemented or looked at equity in philanthropy is by inviting feminist organizations to engage in a reflection with us, with MADRE. And we did this over 2 years to look at how we can actually reflect and embody feminist values and equitable values in our organizations. And the work that we had done with disability movements and racial justice really raised the importance of making sure that we did that in our own in feminist institutions as well, to look at issues of equity. And so we have to recognize that the sector needs reform, but also individual organizations. And so there was an exercise to look at specific indicators to address this type of change, a really honest look at ourselves. Some of what we've learned in MADRE from our work with grassroots organizations, and particularly in shifting resources to the grassroots, it's not without its challenges. And we are addressing various barriers, as we all know. The previous speaker mentioned some of the social cultural norms, obviously, that exist on the ground and which limit women's voice and movements. We've addressed and faced the same issues. And so we have a concerted attention to providing resources for that focus, and then making sure that there's funding for organizational strengthening. Movements need funding, and groups need funding for those types of brick and mortar issues and networking and the systems in order to be effective. And so we call our work Grants Plus. And so when we look at Indigenous movements on the next slide, our mandate is that we see that Indigenous women and girls' collective rights, including their rights to land, territories, and natural resources, are linked directly to their survival, identity, and self-determination. And so we've worked to transform the economic and political systems that drive the climate crisis, that also restore land and water rights to Indigenous and rural people, and promote food sovereignty. And some examples of some of the work we've done with Indigenous movements include Indigenous populations in East Africa, particularly in Kenya and Uganda, in terms of providing funds that enable them to develop sustainable income generating projects, to be able to also protect diversity and also be able to provide alternative food systems and food options to respond to drought, to respond to the climatic change that they're impacting, that they're experiencing. The other area has been with regards to policies. And so the partners in Kenya have been able to mobilize and bring their voices to decision makers so as they are part of discussions happening about climate justice, about land rights, and also about local conflict as well, conflict mitigation. We have partners in Nicaragua that we're working with, in Honduras, also in Guatemala, working with indigenous movements, particularly with regards to even the recognition of indigenous rights. The work that we've done extends to Nepal. And so the support we provided to one of the women's coalitions enabled them to be impactful around the inclusion of indigenous rights in the Constitution, which was a really important outcome, And if we go to the next slide, I do want to mention that the work that we're doing in Colombia, we are a formal partner with the Colombian government, and this partnership enables us to train lawyers, judges, and prosecutors working with the special jurisdiction for peace in Colombia. As Colombia came out of decades of civil war, there's a transitional justice mechanism that was set up, and what we're doing is looking at bringing justice for those who suffered under the civil war. And so it seeks accountability for the killings and persecution of Afro-descendants, and we've been seeing some wins using some of the legal strategies that we've introduced with women's rights groups. But most importantly, I think at the global level, we've seen the implementation of CEDAW Resolution 39, whereby we were able to support movements during the year of 2022, supporting through grant making and advocacy and organizing. And Indigenous women were able to push through and make this resolution a reality. Now what's happening is that they're working at the grassroots level to translate this really important win to the grassroots level. Next. With disability movements, one of the things that we did was to partner with the Mobility International USA, and we invited them to take a critical look at us as an organization and to make recommendations as to how we could integrate disability inclusion as a core part of our work, even beyond what we're already doing. We already have that as a major commitment, but now we looked at how we could make it even stronger. And we also applied an intersectional approach. So for example, we organized trainings for Indigenous populations on how they could also integrate a greater disability inclusion in their work. We've looked also to raise the visibility of disability movements in our advocacy work and in our website and in our partnership activities. The next slide.
Right, you have about
So these are
2 minutes left. 2 minutes.
How many?
2 minutes.
All right, thank you. And so, so the disability movements are another example of where we practice equity. Next, I want to talk about humanitarian aid. We make about 25% of grants per year for humanitarian responses, and again, filling a niche that exists in the funding sector. And we apply a feminist approach, really looking at funding the actors that are already on the ground, that are already caretakers, and making sure that they have the funding to be first responders. We fill those gaps, and we've done this in Ukraine. We've done this in all the hotspots that you can think of in Sudan, Turkey, Uganda, currently in Gaza. And so we have an expertise on supporting humanitarian aid and making sure that that aid supports local economies as opposed to advantaging the mainstream actors who at times are not able to work in those local places. And so I will end with the climate justice, because climate justice is a really key area of work that we implement. And we've been able to work with initiatives all over the world with women-led solutions to climate justice, and really aiming to transform those economic and political systems that drive the climate crisis. And so what we do is to promote women's solutions, listening to women's solutions and funding those solutions, funding them on the ground in communities, but also in policy spaces. And so we've been able to support women's participation in various policy spaces nationally as well as globally, and then funding initiatives on the ground with women farmers, with also communities as they produce and develop alternative livelihoods. And I'll end just by issuing a call for the philanthropic sector to be more intentional, to look at the gaps in our funding, looking at the gaps where the resources are not manifesting, and understanding that with humanitarian aid, for example, only 3.5% of humanitarian aid from OCHA actually is focused on women and girls. And so these are the types of gaps that we're seeing. We've been doing this work for 40 years, and collectively we want to work with the feminist ecosystem to be able to more directly address these gaps and invite other actors to address equity in a more forceful way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Muadi. The power and potential of standing with and enabling change agencies, obviously compelling in this story, and also the clear call for more and better funding for feminist movement, women's rights organization. We will now hear from Elise Stephenson and Betty Barkha about the role of the care economy, why it matters for supporting women's economic participation and benefit, and recommendation for development partners and donors. Over to you.
Thanks so much. It's great to be joining you here today. I'm Dr. Elise Stephenson. I'm the Deputy Director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at the Australian National University, and I'm joined by Dr. Betty Barkha, who is our research coordinator for a very exciting project, the Investing in Women project, which is an Australian government, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Australian aid project that focuses on gender equality and women's economic empowerment in Southeast Asia, particularly in countries such as Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, as well as parts of the Mekong Delta region. Today, we're going to be presenting some of our research that we have used to kick off this partnership with ABD Associates and the Investing in Women team and DFAT on care economy. In particular, we undertook this research earlier this year to map the care economy, government policy and interventions in the case countries, identify kind of future areas for research, but also for action in terms of development in this space. So I might just dig right in. So as part of this review, we focused on defining the care economy in each of the countries, identifying key focus areas, trends and research findings from existing research, understanding the forums where care is discussed, and identifying research policy and practice gaps. As many of you are no doubt aware, particularly since COVID-19, G20 in Indonesia, as well as a number of other kind of coalescing themes, the care economy has come into crystalline focus, and it is, I suppose, an overdue opportunity, but a really important one to understand not just kind of invisible parts of our economy, but also the gender dynamics of labour and of care, and how we can better make policy and practice in this area. We started by defining the care economy, developing this hopefully useful graphic, which we have published and you can find online, basically to be able to outline some of the core components of the care economy. So we define this as involving both paid and unpaid elements, and encompassing everything ranging from disability care, childcare, elder care, nursing and other kinds of healthcare, education and domestic or otherwise unlabelled care. We find that both paid and unpaid parts of the care work and the care economy are gendered. On the unpaid side, we tend to see that care is influenced heavily by cultural norms. It's often family and community-based. There has been some evidence of generational changes occurring in each of the 3 countries that we studied, but it's often slow, incomplete, and sporadic. On the other hand, when we look at paid care economy, we are restricted by a lack of or minimal formal training qualifications that are required, which also contribute to a devaluation of the care economy. It's heavily reliant on migration and migrant work, and the quality and quantity of care providers remain a challenge. Within this kind of framing, it should be noted that some of our most common aspects of the care economy, like childcare, are not well defined. It tends to be a term that's taken for granted, which also contributes to, I guess, a lack of visibility or ability to carefully define and make policy around this important part of the care economy. In our research, we found that definitions of care and care systems still remain underdeveloped. This ultimately limits the ability of countries to set policy as well as share common learnings. We found that by undertaking a baseline mapping of care interventions and opportunities, we still don't know the full kind of circumstance around what kinds of interventions are out there, whether or not they work, and we tend to see this kind of disparate and localized practices that happen at multiple different levels, but they're not necessarily kind of linked up, which may impact on effectiveness as well as kind of experiences within the care economy. We've noted that interventions that target structural or organisational impacts may provide the best opportunity for systemic gains, particularly around gender equality. But when it comes to some of the interventions that we're starting to see interventions that are very focused on kind of fixing individual women or fixing individuals. So we'd like to see a lot more attention developed and kind of focused on structural reforms as well as supporting organisations to embed changes. Intersectionality is also something that is largely overlooked when it comes to the care economy. So we find that there is often a kind of a lack of sensitivity to cultural and religious norms, localised practices, understandings of historical precedents, as well as an understanding of kind of the intersectional dynamics of care work. LGBTIQ+ individuals are often completely absent in the literature, as well as disability care. We could find almost nothing on disability care across these countries. So we've got a lot of invisibilised types of care, which also then feeds into big policy gaps and research gaps. We found a disproportionate burden of care experienced by women in the 3 focus countries limits their ability to participate in the workforce, but that by kind of framing a lot of interventions around kind of helping some women get ahead doesn't really tackle the underlying gender dynamics of the care economy. So we really want to encourage development organisations as well as researchers to really ensure that, we're not just addressing care economy gaps by helping some women succeed, but not really changing the overarching dynamics of care. Whilst we are seeing some trends in terms of care work being increasingly economically valued through both professionalisation as well as formalisation of the care economy, a lot of new startups and businesses entering this space as well as government policy, we're still seeing that care workers face low pay, poor working conditions, which has a flow-on effect as well to those who are not formal carers or qualified carers, but informal carers. So we kind of see a devaluation across the sector. And from our analysis, we kind of identify 4 main actors involved in the provision of care that, besides families and individuals, which can be a focus for a lot of this work. So government, NGOs, international organisations and the private sector. Having a look quickly at the care economy and women's labour force participation in the countries, we see that women continue to be less active in the labour force. And for a lot of development organisations and government intervention in this space, this is a primary focus of why we need improvements in care economy. In essence, it is seen that being able to get greater labour force participation is good. Addressing the care economy situation will help to do that. But a lack of affordability, quality childcare services have been identified as a major barrier, and there are still social expectations that women should take on the burden of care, even whilst also participating in the formal paid economy. From this, I guess we identify a number of trends. So firstly, I suppose we have unpaid domestic duties and double burden affect women's ability to perform in the paid economy. Cultural and historical influences underpin the gender division of care and must be part of our solutions or our kind of policy. Because we have an increasing demand for care services, this is an economic opportunity for the private sector, but it is also a public sector responsibility to ensure that whilst some of these labour force shifts are occurring, we can also encourage more social and gender norms shifts. So, for instance, there's evidence that although more women are entering the paid labour force, men aren't necessarily entering the unpaid domestic labour and care economy to the same degree. This needs to be a major focus, and it remains to be something which can cause issues depending on some of the countries that we're working in. Migration and the status of women in the formal economy. So the devaluing of women's work generally has lots of implications in terms of pay, respect, recognition, and being able to address some of those I guess inequalities and migration patterns is also a really important part of this. Addressing gendered shifts. So whilst there have been some changes in how care is perceived and who should be and who is doing the work, changes shouldn't be guaranteed. They're not guaranteed. So we shouldn't assume that younger generations will naturally be more progressive on some of these issues. There's some evidence that there's substantial backlash in some younger cohorts. So therefore, we see change as sporadic, and being able to support gender norms shifting at a more localised level is therefore really, really key. And when we look at some of the care economy interventions and solutions that we're starting to see flood the market, well, we need to ensure that we have the research and transparency around the effectiveness or the evaluation of some of these policies and programs, as we are missing the critical evidence right now on what actually is working. And we need to ensure that we have this across a range of different contexts. We also believe that being able to understand this in terms of the context of class and sexuality, rural and urban divides, that remains quite a gap. I'll hand over to Betty to run us through a few slides now.
Thanks, Elise, and thank you, everyone. My name is Dr. Betty Barkha, and I have the immense pleasure of working with Elise on this piece of research. Building on what Elise has just mentioned, the increasing demand for formal care services is as a result of women's labour force participation. So obviously, naturally, because women are entering the labour force, but also as a result of the inherent survival needs of people, and which is also contributing to the movement of people, rural to urban shifts as well. This, as Elise has mentioned, does not necessarily mean that the men are taking on more domestic care responsibilities. So the increasing number of women's labour force participation, plus their care load burdens, plus the generational shifts, is contributing to an increasing demand for formal care services. And that being mentioned, thank you, Elise. And that being mentioned, I will speak a little bit to the migration of care. As we know, in current times, everybody, regardless of all genders, are migrating for work for various socioeconomic reasons. And the consequences are significantly for those that are left behind. In most cases, for the 3 case study countries, it was the elderly or the children who get left behind. And the care of this is dependent on the significant person who is in country. So as you can see, when fathers migrate, mothers usually continue to perform care duties. Whereas when mothers migrate, fathers rely on female female members of the family to take on these responsibilities. Transnational labor migration from the three countries is quite high. And the Vietnam, Philippines, and Indonesia are exporting highest exporters of labor migration, really. And so they continue to migrate in search for better job opportunities. And in most cases, the data reflects that they are migrating for formalized care roles in other countries. Thank you. The professionalization and regulation of the care economy across this case study countries is coming as a recurring theme. There is also more research conducted recently around the digitalization of the care economy, which is an ongoing area of research, particularly in Southeast Asia. Aged and childcare qualifications and training in the three focus countries are lagging. So while paid care work remains undervalued, other forms of care like disability care are poorly understood, as mentioned by Elise. Some are just assumed, for example, childcare is just assumed and not defined, whereas there is a clear absence of data on disability and therefore limiting what can be done to address that. The reliance on underqualified family networks for the provision of care is something also that is increasingly being relied upon for complex needs such as disability care or the care of aging populations, leading to insufficient health outcomes for the elderly. We know for a fact that there are very strong family and social and communal ties that people often rely on within these communities, and that continues to be something that is being researched. How the care economy is taking into account existing sociocultural norms and how it's going to be influenced is something that is of great interest to researchers, and longitudinal research is definitely something that will inform greater understanding and policy response for that. Finally, I think disproportionately it is evident, and there is significant evidence that showcases that women across their diversities in Southeast Asia are overrepresented in the formal care sector. So many of them are undervalued and underpaid and have limited employment benefits. And this is just something that continues to exacerbate existing gender inequality gaps. Thank you. Next slide, Mary. So speaking more to the generational shifts in attitudes, as Elise mentioned, it cannot be assumed that these are for the better. There are instances where gender norms are being reinforced within the younger generation, but there is also studies that reveal that 36.7% of 26 to 50-year-olds agreed that women should be the primary caregiver in the family. And I think that this reinforces the gendered norms that continue to be inherited and reinforced over time. There is also attitudes towards the gender division of unpaid labor is not shifting as much in Indonesia as they are in Vietnam or the Philippines. Traditional gender roles remain pervasive among the younger generations, and this means understanding what household chores are considered women's jobs and what are men's, the feminization of household chores and who does that. There is still the notion that men are the breadwinners and women are the homemakers in these situations, and that continues to be reinforced, unfortunately, perpetuating existing and harmful gender norms. The generational norm shifts could have a substantial impact on the future of care trends in case study countries. However, the scope of this depth, particularly with or without intervention, has not effectively been measured and is definitely an area of evidence gap and definitely something that researchers are looking to build towards. However, I do want to end on the note that there are some notes indicative that there are shifting gender attitudes that incorporate gender equality considerations, but they are not significant enough to substantially change the findings, which reinforce gender inequality. So passing it back to Elise, sorry.
Yeah, thanks so much, Betty. So I won't go through this too much, but just to say different states are taking different approaches to the care economy. Canada is one example where we do have some evidence, but it would be great, and we're lacking some of this data from other states. So they advocate for the 5 R's, so recognising the value of unpaid and poorly paid care work, reducing drudgery, redistributing responsibility, ensuring unpaid and paid care workers are represented and have voice, and responding to their rights and needs. When we have a look at who's doing what across the region, we see that government predominantly is starting to enact some sort of laws and policies and regulations. They're key in enforcement, which is also a weakness for a lot of governments. So even if they do have some more progressive gender equality policies, like in the Philippines, enforcement and accountability is generally a weak spot for governance. They're critical to messaging around the care economy, promoting some of the limited research that is happening, provision of some state-run care, quality assurance for care work, including training and professionalisation, as well as funding for this kind of nationally growing industry. We see NGOs and IGOs being important in trialling and running on-ground interventions, but critically that must be linked to monitoring and evaluation, of which currently we have really little evidence. So even though we've got a lot of IGOs and NGOs that are doing this important work, often that accountability and kind of transparency on what they're doing and what actually happened as a result is missing. They do have a policy influence voice. Perhaps it could be used more effectively in some areas to identify some specific gaps. Private sector, of course, has a super important role here too. So provision of care, of course, meeting care-related regulations or legal and policy obligations, which again really reinforces the importance of addressing structural inequalities in our kind of care policy, lobbying government, trialling interventions, and I guess partnering with research institutions. Overall, we've got a brief kind of case of the countries, which because of time I won't go into too much, but we do see trends across the countries. Child care, for instance, is often decentralised. Government support and coordination is growing in some instances, but really needs to be reinforced by the research and the evidence, as well as kind of community collaborative partnerships and international partnerships that can help to, I guess, spread the impact. And we are still lacking infrastructure and kind of training mechanisms and quality assurance mechanisms that could be really key. As far as some of the gaps that we see, we've really broken this down into 4 main areas. So shifting social norms, so what kinds of programs and policies and projects have had the greatest impact, what would encourage the uptake of more unpaid domestic labour by men, and potentially around some campaigns that advocate around gender norms shifting. Working with organisations to understand, strengthen or establish standards are another gap. So looking at, well, what's currently working in organisations, what kinds of policy influence is needed in terms of minimum standards for leave, childcare accessibility, flexible work, recognition for age and disability care. And there are a lot of cross-organisational opportunities there to share policy and best practice, which I think is a real opportunity for us as practitioners and researchers to get together and do. There are gaps in terms of encouraging government policy change, so we really need to map policy options to social and economic costs and benefits across the countries studied. It's critical to understand some of the policy and legislation gaps, challenges to enforcement, issues around coordination of policies and implementation. That includes, again, some basic standards around leave, accessibility, flexible work, qualifications and accreditations, and so on. And finally, supporting individuals. So understanding the impact of rising costs of living on low-income families, for instance, ensuring that we're not just supporting some women to get ahead and some families to get ahead by ingraining kind of gender inequalities in some of our interventions, improving quality and quantity of childcare and other care opportunities, and providing some of those care-related programs that specifically speak to intersectionality. Just to say, we'll leave on intersectional approach to care is really critical. And we're very happy to take questions later around some of the interventions that could alter the value of care, which includes lifting minimum wages, paying informed care workers, providing better training, developing models that could value paid work, unpaid work more. I'll leave it there. Thanks so much, Bettina.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stephenson and Dr. Barkha. I do want to make sure you know I acknowledge you probably in our introductions at the start, but I know we had some technical issues, so I'm so happy that you were able to join after a little bit of stress that you may not have been able to hear this great presentation. So thank you so much for highlighting the importance of shifting social norms. The care economy is so central to enabling productive and reproductive lives and to advancing gender equality. So it will now move to questions. We have about 24 minutes. And so I'm opening up to the floor to you all to ask questions, and we'll share the mic into the room. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. I really enjoyed all the panels and all the discussions. I'm Annabelle Delhunty from Crawford, and I guess I just had a question for two of the presentations, if that was okay. First to Dr. Nina, I just wanted to ask whether there is, I guess, acknowledgement of some of the harms of potential of microcredit at these, particularly by these non-financial banking institutions and whatnot, whether that's sort of coming to be seen outside of the academic literature, because my work on microcredit in India has really looked at the different models, but most of the debate seems to be in the academic realm, whereas there's still massive amounts being funded through, say, the World Bank and through Asian Development Bank and various particularly banks, but also bilateral aid programs. So I was just interested if you'd sort of seen any traction outside of the academic realm. And then my question is just a quick question to those working on the care economy, just whether you'd looked at any of the sort of literature on social reproduction, and particularly if you'd sort of drawn out the real class elements in it as well. You did mention it, but I just was interested. Thank you.
Yes, let's take one more and then we'll go.
Sure. Thank you so much. So my name's Amy Kutsia. I'm from the MADRE Foundation over in Perth. And for those that don't know, it's now Australia's largest philanthropy. So my question's actually for Dr. Muadi as well. And the first one is, I was really excited to hear about when you said that MADRE invited feminist organizations to do reflections. And it's something we're looking at as part of our stakeholder engagement process as well, from philanthropy to philanthropy, just wondering about the process of ensuring that when, I would be so curious to hear how you went about that to ensure that it wasn't an extractive process in terms of how you were gaining this information and these insights from the feminist organizations. How were they compensated or rewarded? It's something we're really looking at and wanting to model well. So I think MADRE would be a great example. And Dr. Stephenson as well, I was so glad you at the end jumped into that great slide about what missing critical evidence we need to show what's working. I was just wondering, there's been a lot of discussion around how we need to improve not just the description, but also the messaging of what's the return on investment. And I think particularly we're finding that just because we have the great evidence, a lot of what you presented, there seems to be a link we need to make more obvious to policymakers and decision makers around the fact that if there are improvements to accessibility, affordability, et cetera, of childcare or care in general, that more women will go into the paid workforce. And I don't know if this message is actually getting through or translating or has enough backing. So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll go first to Sara, then Muadi, then Betty and Elise.
Yeah, I agree that a lot of the criticisms of microfinance happen in the academy rather than in the sector. And I have to say that when we spoke in August at the UN Feminist Finance Forum, I'm not going to say we were censored exactly, but we were we were very strongly encouraged and had our presentation edited to look at the positives of this. And some of those slides I didn't get to show in August. So yeah, the sectors are kind of self-fulfilling. They haven't taken on board a lot of the criticisms that have come out of deeply grounded, rigorous ethnographic studies like the 2 PhD studies that I mentioned in my work. We still thought it was worthwhile going and having a say and having be able to give those recommendations at the end. But I do agree with you. It's actually hard to get any traction in the sector, which is why I keep banging on about it at things like this.
Please do. I'm sure on behalf of the room, yeah, we are encouraging you to, Sara. I'm going to Muadi now.
Yes, thank you for the question with regards to the initiative around equitable practices in feminist organizations. I will actually have the executive director of MADRE reach out to you if I can get your contact information, since she led that initiative. And it was before I joined MADRE, and I'm stepping in for her, who she was supposed to make that presentation today. But I can tell you that we are committed to learning as part of our work. And there are several exercises or, collective thinking that we're engaged in. We're in a similar process with feminist funds to look at what we've learned around resourcing initiatives led by young women, particularly young women who are responders in humanitarian settings. And so there's a research report that will be launched in March around that effort. And I spoke also about the work we did over 2 years to make sure that we were embodying our principles around disability justice as well. So as we have experience in the sector and in the work that we do, we make sure to take a pause to learn from it. But I'll make sure to get back to you on your specific question on the initiative with executive directors of feminist organizations.
Thank you. I'll go to Elise and Betty.
Yeah, of course. And thank you so much for the question around kind of the return on investment. I think you're right, that the business case, if you will, the return on investment for investing in the care economy and, reforming policy and all of the rest, could be clearer. And there's a lot more research that could go into this. However, what a lot of our research indicates also that this isn't a purely economic decision. It's not that governments and communities don't know that it's more economically valuable to properly value women, right? Or to address gender norms. There is an element of backlash and resistance here that is norms-based and that is, gendered and cultural and all of these other sorts of things. So therefore, we actually have to look at kind of some of these power structures and what would it actually mean to confront some of these power structures. We have good evidence, we have good anecdotal evidence of, and this is globally, not just in the region, of a lot of states pushing back on all kinds of things. If you mention women in all their diversities or gender diversity or any of these sorts of terms, that is a red flag to a lot of states, as well as to some sorts of funders and investors. Any suggestion of changing norms can be met with resistance in some cases. And so in that case, we can't just make evidence-based economic arguments. And to a degree, there's going to be a lot of cultural backlash and resistance that we have to get much more savvy about. This isn't a purely economic argument. It's not a purely economic resistance. Therefore, the return on investment, that is a really important part of the work. However, I also think we have to get a bit more savvy about this because it's not just about economics here. It's also about power. And people are reluctant to give up their power once they've got it, right? And this is at a structural gender equality level. So that is something that I would love to see more investigation in, to see, well, what are the other compelling reasons that we can and should take up in this area?
Go back to the room and please, another round of questions, please.
Thank you so much for that. My name is Nalini Singh from the Fiji Women's Rights Movement. And I just wanted to add to the conversation around unpaid care work and the accounting for it. The conversations back at home, and I don't know whether Betty is aware about this, but in the accounting for it, in the traditional measures of economy that we have, GDP and what else, and even when census is done, those that are in unpaid care work or domestic work, it's accounted for as the innkeeper level. Those that, the really old ways, archaic ways of measuring that. But when you look at unpaid care work from the perspective of now, I mean, that's our context, it's management level or even more. So I'm wondering whether in the countries you did your study in, was there even any conversation around, well, if we add that to the measurements of how our economy is doing, perhaps then there's going to be a shift in traction? Because say, for example, when we are looking at gender-based violence, what women in the women's movement have done is, we've tried to put a value to the cost of violence to get governments to act, put in policy measures, etc. So I'm wondering whether this came into conversation in your research. And the other one was, what I've seen back at home as well is, they're very well-intentioned employers who would put in creches for, mothers and children, in the workplace and all, and other measures. But, women are never asked. Women are never asked about what do they want, because, we are beginning to learn that those that perhaps are working in a factory or in an office, that 9 to 5 is perhaps the only me time she would ever get. And she doesn't want to spend her half-an-hour tea break or a 45-minute lunch, back in the creche with her child, because that's her time. Because when she goes back, she's again contributing another 5 to 6 hours in unpaid care work. So in this whole equation of looking at, well, what are the solutions? We have to put in a system of going back to the women and asking, well, what do you want? What would work best for you so that you're a happy, a worker contributing to wherever she is contributing. And I think that's a missing, bit in the different measures we are trying to put into place, because it's for women, but they're never asked.
Okay, all right, thank you. Farheen Kuram from Palladium. So question on the microcredit. I have worked with Barkha in Bangladesh and have been able to see firsthand how microcredit was really utilized and, helped women and their households. But on the flip side of it, I've also seen increase in gender-based violence because of microcredit, and how men actually took control of the money and then had their own business set up, and same results as you're talking about. But my experience was more than 10 years ago. So I'm just thinking what has really evolved and changed, because there's been more studies, for decades. I also feel like while we look at the barriers, there are enablers. So again, going back to Bangladesh context, there are people in the community who play a very vital role in socializing what role women play and how important these microcredit loans could be for the family. For instance, we've seen some of the women households where children are now going to school, or they have better nutritional intake because of this loan, and they have some access to finance. We've also seen how in some programs, you go to the mosque, you talk to the imams, and you socialize that concept of women's role, and they are the ones who are influencing the community. I mean, I'm looking around this room and it's majority women. There are male champions around here, and it's great to see that. But I feel like they are also very much part and parcel of this conversation. So I guess going back, I want to hear what sort of enabling structures did you see in your study that we could take in our practices when we're implementing different programs in different cultures and communities?
Thank you. We'll take one more questions and then go back to the panels. Just that.
Thank you to all the presenters. My name is Bridget Grover and I work for DFAT. I had a quick question for Dr. Elise and Dr. Betty, please, just on some more nitty-gritty down to the sectoral level. So what sectors did you look at, and if there were sectoral differences, so apparel versus agriculture, and then in terms of poverty quintiles too, so do you see any differences between the poorest of the, kind of back to Annabelle's question, class differences, poverty requirements? So the poorest of the poor obviously don't have any choice between choosing reproductive work or productive work, and they have to do both. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll go to you, Sara, first, and then again, I'll go to Betty and Elise afterwards.
Thanks. I guess it's about making the distinction between what are the aims of the program, and if the aims of the program are perhaps, other things like you said, if nutrition of children increases or whatever, but we were assessing them on their claims to the empowerment of women. And as I showed from those studies, there wasn't much evidence, and I'm not sure there is much evidence globally. One of those studies I quoted from in that presentation, the Dubin Duck and MADRE one, they did like a review of reviews of microfinance, and they really couldn't find a lot of evidence to prove that these programs empowered women or reduced much poverty actually as well. I know the programs in Bangladesh have been running for 40 or 50 years now, and I'm not sure what overall studies have been about how they've assisted in reducing poverty. As far as the enabling structures go, I guess that's what I was trying to get at in those recommendations, that the groups need to, if they're going to be about empowering women, then they need to have those added social benefits as well, that they're safe spaces for women to meet and learn how to grow in confidence and learn how to be leaders. And a lot of those, the one example I gave from the Solomon Islands, the research study conducted by another academic said that the spaces they created there did do that for women. So there's looking at the different alternative models, concentrating on savings, that sort of thing, rather than just keep giving women more debt, which not everyone can manage. And also the fact that not all women are entrepreneurs, it's sort of expecting all women, and that there are markets for their businesses as well, which often isn't the case. So those recommendations hopefully included answering some of those sort of structural issues, enabling issues.
Elise and Betty.
Perfect. I'll start. And thank you for the questions. I do want to start by saying that this was a secondary data research. So we did rely extensively on what was out there as we begin a different phase of the Investing in Women project. And so some of your questions will quite possibly be well answered towards the end of this phase, but I am going to have a go at it. To your question, Nalini, for sure, we're quite cognizant that existing methodologies of measuring the GDP have its limitations, and that's definitely that is something we kept in mind during our analysis and in our methodology. We, as part of the Investing in Women program for the next few years, the intention is to do multi-year research and understand what works for women in these countries and try to understand how that can be enabled through investments such as the one with Investing in Women in collaboration between DFAT and these three countries. I think there is obviously quite a clear recognition that women particularly are burdened by the workload. And so even those within the formal sectors are turning up to jobs with at least 3 to 5 hours of work pre-starting their formal employment. And I think this is not being lost in the context of understanding care economy and how we're going to approach it and what methodologies need to be targeted to look at it. So it's definitely something that is at the back of our mind when we're doing this analysis and taking into consideration the intersectional components of that. To the second question, there is one thing around the sectors of inclusion and exclusion. One sector we did not include intentionally was healthcare workers. And that was something we did intentionally because often the literature on care economy referred to care workers such as nurses, doctors, and those in that sector in a different lens. And so that was something we did not include. Everything else that was available in secondary data, we did try to include to an extent. I do want to mention that there was a limitation of gender disaggregated data to the extent that we would have liked it to be available, but I'm going to pass it on to Elise to elaborate further. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much, Betty. I think that that question around sectoral differences and, one of the things that we have been very conscious of in coming to this program, Investing in Women, has been basically, the reality that a lot of initiatives in this space have sought to, for instance, establish within workplaces a creche, as I think has been mentioned, or some sort of other sort of on campus or on location childcare services and sports and all those kinds of things. Or that you can get some women into the paid economy by relying on the care labour of other women, and mostly poorer women or women who have fewer options or opportunities. So one thing that we've been really conscious of is that whatever interventions are proposed and however we go ahead working with both private sectors and governments has been that we really don't want to replicate that whole kind of current reality of, well, we'll help some women get ahead, but that's in relying on the gendered labour of other poorer women. I think that's a really big problem that hasn't been fully addressed in the research to date, but this is certainly something that we're kind of pushing. From the sectoral differences, so at this stage, given that this was a really short landscape study, we haven't delved into that fully. What I will note is that multinationals that operate across several different countries tend to be better at providing some of these provisions for localized workers. And for women who are in micro-entrepreneurship, for instance, there's often a much more overlap between paid and unpaid work throughout the progress of the day. So we'd love to do more research in that. We'd love to chat more too if you have particular insights or kind of research directions that could really aid us when it comes to understanding some of these sectoral differences.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time for another question. So I am going to wrap us up. So first of all, thank you so much to our speakers for sharing their knowledge and insight and demonstrating why feminist analysis and gender-informed and responsive research and deeply engaging with lived experience are so foundational to shifting power. From Sara, we've heard mainstream microfinance program inappropriate for women in extreme poverty. Mainstream microfinance programs don't address structural gender inequality and often fail to empower women as they claim. And we've also heard that that message needs to be heard loud and clear and made space to be heard. We've heard from Muadi that working directly with women local led groups moves social change from paper to practice, and the importance of best practice in localizing and decolonizing aid and philanthropy. And recognizing MADRE's intersectional approach that's really reflecting on equity in practice. We can really learn from their practice in working and partnering with marginalized groups, elevating their power, practicing equity in philanthropy. And then finally, the takeaway from Elise and Betty, strengthen the evidence base on care work and the care economy and ground care economy investment in principles of gender equality. Care economy intervention should not replicate, extend, or create new inequalities. Fix systems, not women, is what we've heard loud and clear. So a common theme across all this contribution is the need to really focus on changing system that create gender inequality in the first place, rather than requiring women to change in order to get ahead. If you want to hear more about feminist approaches to systems change, I really encourage you to join the session tomorrow morning at 8:30 on feminist foreign policy and practical strategies for transforming systems in power. Before we close, please bring your hands together to really thank our wonderful panelists. Thank you. And I think lunch is served.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Nice meeting you all.
Thanks, Bettina. Thanks, Sarah.